Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Proclaim Peace podcast, where we pull principles and practices of peace building out of the scriptures. I'm your co-host, Patrick Mason. I'm here, as always, with Jen Thomas. Hey, Jen, how you doing?
Hello, Patrick. I'm doing okay.
All right. Well, in this episode, as we continue, so we're diving into the Old Testament this season, obviously. And in this episode, we're going to talk about, I think, one of the more memorable stories of the Old Testament. It's yet another strange story out of the Old Testament, but it's the story of the Tower of Babel. And of course, I think everybody's heard this story that people are building this tower, it's going to reach up into the heavens. And this is a time when everybody spoke the same language. And then God divides them. This, at least as the story goes, this is the beginning of all of the different languages of humanity. And in a lot of ways, there's a lot of things that you could do with this story, a lot of different directions that you could go. But I think it's interesting to think along with this story in terms of simply the question and the fact of human diversity. What do we do with the fact that human beings, all part of the same species, are actually all very different, with different languages, different ethnicities, different nationalities, all this kind of difference? What do we do with it in the world after Babel?
Well, and what strikes me is that there's this narrative that people can collaborate. They can cooperate when there's this sameness. When they're all similar, when they have a unified language, they're able to be unified in purpose. And one of the ways that I think of interpreting this story is that God is also telling us that that is also not how he wants us to work together, that he wants us to work together across differences, that is the challenge of being human, is not just saying, I can only work with people who are like me or think like me and act like me. That doesn't make me divine. What helps me be more divine is to figure out how to recognize the richness that comes from this, multiplicity of, possibility amongst human beings. And I think that one of the reasons that the guest that's joining us today that we wanted to bring on and share with you is because once that breaks down, once you've got people from different perspectives, having different viewpoints, different approaches to the world, the only way that you can effectively bridge those divides is through communication.
Exactly. And at that point, the diversity of human language and human perspective isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. Of the system. It is actually the way that God designed it so that we could learn from one another. And I think, in the New Testament, there's in some ways a reversal of Babel at the day of Pentecost when because of the Holy Spirit they can all understand each other. But what's really interesting is that God doesn't erase their differences.
Yeah.
He doesn't erase the fact that they all speak different languages. He just makes them intelligible to one another. And I think that's the work of healing. That's the work of the Holy Spirit. How do we learn to understand one another across differences rather than trying to eliminate all difference altogether?
Exactly. And the guest that we are bringing to you today is one who is bridging some of the most difficult differences imaginable and trying to do that through compassion, curiosity, and dialogue. Daryl Davis has spent his career as a professional musician. That's his first and primary occupation, including decades playing alongside rock and roll legends like Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis. But he is also known for his efforts to fight racism by engaging directly and personally with members of the KKK, many with whom he developed relationships of trust and even friendships. He's taken white supremacy head on and done it as a person who was bearing the brunt of white supremacy. Daryl now estimates that he's been instrumental in persuading over 200 white supremacists to leave their hate groups, and he's going to share with us a little bit more today about his lived experience and how he's done that. Daryl, welcome. We are so grateful to have you as a guest here on Proclaim Peace.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Glad to be here with you.
Well, we're excited to jump in and hear your perspectives. But before we get into sort of the details and the weeds of things, we'd love to start with the question that we offer to all of our guests, which is, how do you define peace?
Well, I have several definitions to define peace. I think the absence of conflict, the state of tranquility, the presence of civil disagreement. But also, I think one of my fellow musicians probably said it best, the late, great Jimi Hendrix. He said, when the power of love overcomes the love of power, there will be peace.
That is fantastic. I've never heard that definition, but I love that. And I love it. Was that in a song lyric or just something he said?
Something he said.
Something said. Okay. Well, there are a million things we could ask you. I would love to spend an hour just talking to you about your musical career.
Well, we can always do a part two, you know?
Yeah. We can do a part two. We'll see if you're sick of us after part one. But we want to talk about how we can pull out principles of peacemaking from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Bible. And we're going to zero in on the Tower of Babel story and then just kind of see where it goes from there. But people have read this story lots of different ways. This story of people who were united at once and then who were divided in different ways. When you read that story, how does it speak to you at all? What do you feel like that story has to teach us about unity, about division, about whatever direction it takes you?
I think, well, first of all, you know, I don't believe the Tower of Babel actually existed in real life. I believe, you know, it's a metaphor or a story. Mm-hmm. But I think what it teaches us is that people will use things and turn them around to edify, if you will, themselves, like building a tower to reach God or to reach the heavens or whatever. Because, you know, you always think of somebody who's almighty as being high on almighty, so you go up, that kind of thing. But, you know, I deal with a lot of white supremacists, neo-Nazis and KKK members and things like that. And of course, they've taken the story and they've turned it around, you know, to say, well, you know, God scattered everybody because that's the way he wants them to be. He does not want them to be together. So, you know, that's their definition. But I counter that with God gave everybody something. And the beauty of it is when we share with each other and bring it all together. It's like making a jigsaw puzzle. Every piece is different. Every piece may have a certain color or different colors to whatever, but the puzzle becomes beautiful when those pieces link together. And that to me is, you know, if I had to say what the Tower of Babel means to me is God giving us that challenge to learn how to get along with one another because we all have something to contribute to the world that he created.
So I love this. And I think you've actually highlighted, perhaps intentionally, one of the really important reasons that Patrick and I are doing this podcast is because scripture is something that we have to interpret, right? Like these are meant to be stories and narratives that we take broad lessons from. And you've just highlighted really beautifully the way that one story could be used in diametrically opposed ways, right? And I think that one of the things that we're so interested in helping people understand is that's a choice. And scripture at its best is used to bring us closer to one another, to help elevate the value of each of God's children. And I love the way that you have interpreted this story to be inclusive, and to invite a wide variety of voices to participate and to demonstrate that, in fact, that's what God intends, right? Like God does not want us divided.
Well, doesn't God's choir have tenors, altos, bass, baritones, contraltos, first sopranos, etc.? And each one of those voices plays a part that makes those harmonies, you know, what are beautiful.
It makes me, the way that you framed it makes me think of Jesus' teaching when he said, you know, that you'll always have the poor with you. That doesn't mean that poverty is a good thing. That doesn't mean that, you know, that we want to reify that. But it means that in this condition we're in, there are just certain aspects of what it means to be mortal and what it means to live a human existence. Poverty is one of those things. Difference and division. For me, Jesus is when he says the poor are always with you. This is always an invitation and a challenge, not an excuse. So the same thing it seems to me with the Tower of Babel. This idea that there is division, that there is difference, that there is diversity among us. It's an invitation. It's an opportunity for us, not an excuse to lean into that some of your white supremacist friends, maybe do.
So one of the things that strikes me about your work is that you are using communication. You're using outreach to other people to build bridges with those who are themselves using communication, words, actions to kind of create and foment hate. So you're trying to take this same tool and repurpose it towards something good. And I'm wondering if you could share with our listeners what this has taught you about the power and role of language in terms of both promoting peace and how we can learn to be more cautious and wise in how we use it.
Sure. Well, you know, I feel that the greatest weapon known to man to dismantle conflict, you know, it's not the bullet or the bomb or the tank or things like that. but yet it is the most underused tool and the least expensive. It's free. It's called conversation. When two enemies or two adversaries, however you want to frame it, enemies, whatever, when two enemies are talking, they're not fighting, they're talking.
Yeah.
Perhaps they're disagreeing, maybe even getting a little loud, but at least they're talking. It's when the conversation ceases that the ground becomes fertile for violence. So we want to keep the conversation going. Now, action speaks louder than words. What's the old saying? A picture is worth 1,000 words. But the words have to be credible, and they have to match the action. So, I've been to 65 countries on 6 continents. I've been to all 50 states. And I can tell you something, that no matter how far I go from our own country, whether it's right next door to Canada, or right next door to Mexico, or across the Atlantic or Pacific, halfway around the globe, no matter who I meet, perhaps they don't, look like me, or speak my language, or worship as I do, maybe don't even worship at all. I've always concluded that every single person I've encountered anywhere on this planet is a human being. And as such, every human being wants these 5 core values in their lives. Everyone wants to be loved. Everyone wants to be respected. We all want to be heard. We want to be treated fairly and truthfully. And we want the same things for our family as anyone else would want for their family. And if we can learn to apply those 5 core values, or any of those 5 values, when we find ourselves in a contentious or adversarial situation, or in a society or culture in which we're unfamiliar or uncomfortable, I'll guarantee you that your navigation of that situation, that culture, that society will be much more positive, much more smooth, and much more productive. And language is the communicatory tool that we use.
It strikes me that 4 of those first 4 really are linked to communication, right? They're about having people feel heard, having be respected, that we can, just like you said, in really inexpensive and thoughtful ways, accomplish 4 of those 5 desires just by being willing to engage with people.
And respect does not necessarily mean that you respect what the person is saying.
Yeah.
Because, I don't respect what the white supremacists tell me about myself, but I respect their right to air their view. And in exchange, they reciprocate and listen to me. And that's how bridges are built and how bridges are crossed.
I wonder, could you talk a little bit more about that, Daryl? Because normally we think about conversation, at least when I think about it, I think about my ability to speak. Right? The real conversation, there's always 2 sides. There's the speaking and then the listening. It seems that for a lot of people, myself included, the listening might be the harder part of those 2 sides of the coin. So can you talk a little bit about listening, especially listening, maybe from your own work, listening to things that are hard that you don't believe in? Some people might say, I don't want to be in spaces where I hear things that I know are untrue, right? The racist ideas, sexist ideas, and so forth. Like that in some ways I give space to, or I even validate those views if I stop and listen to them. So how do you think about that in terms of listening as that other side of conversation?
Well, especially, when I'm dealing with people of those ideologies, even black supremacists or something like that, I realize that they have not seen nor experienced the things that I have in my life. I'm not saying I know everything and I've experienced it all. No, by no means. But let me give you my favorite quote of all time. It's by Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, and he had a lot of quotes. But one of my favorite ones is called the travel quote by him. And Mark Twain said, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime." And that is so true. Take that, and when, our U.S. Census Bureau, according to them, less than 40% of Americans even own a passport. They say that we don't travel. European people travel all the time. They're always going somewhere, and all the travel that I've done does not make me a better human being than someone with less travel. But what it does is it gives me a broader and better perspective on humanity than someone who has not had that exposure and that that education. And that's what I bring to the table to share with those who may not travel. And because, they only see what they're seeing. Like, for example, I may give anywhere between 60 and 80 lectures a year, especially during non-COVID years. High schools, elementary schools, corporations, colleges, synagogues, churches, police departments, civic organizations, et cetera, right? I can tell you this, 2 to 3 out of every 10 lectures I give, mostly on college campuses. It does happen elsewhere, but mostly on college campuses, this will happen. I'll give the lecture, I'll bring some robes and hoods and swastika flags or whatever I've received from people who've now renounced that ideology. And I'll show them, I'll do a Q&A at the end of the lecture, but then when it's over, there'll still be some students who want to ask one last question, and they'll approach the podium or they want to touch one of the robes, what have you. 2 to 3 out of 10 times, there's going to be some student hanging in the back of the auditorium, and I've come to learn what's up. He or she is waiting for the crowd to go away from me, from the podium. And once the crowd dissipates and I'm packing up my stuff, he or she comes down and they look around, make sure nobody's within earshot. Well, hi, Mr. Davis. I really enjoyed your lecture. We shake hands. They look around again, and then they whisper, I was raised like that. My mother is in the Klan, or my dad is a neo-Nazi skinhead, or, whatever. Mm-hmm. That's how I was raised. I'm from wherever. And now I'm here at University of fill in the blank, and my girlfriend is black, or my boyfriend is Jewish, or my best friend is gay, whatever the case may be. And that's how I was raised. And I can't go home and bring my friend home. My parents will kill me. My parents will disown me. And so then I don't want to tell my friend because they'll drop me. So they got this secret that's burning on their chest, causing an ulcer, and they need to talk to somebody. I'm that somebody. Because I totally get it. They come from some perhaps rural area or some homogenous area where everyone goes to the same high school. They all vote for the same political candidate. They all cheer the same sports team, swim at the same neighborhood swimming pool, etc. So, but now they've left the neighborhood and high school, and now they're on this college campus. The neighborhood and high school don't come to the college campus, but on that college campus, there may be neighborhoods and high schools from all over the country and all over the world. And so they're seeing things that they did not see back home. And they're learning that Jewish people don't have horns and black people don't have tails and whatever else other myths, that they were raised to believe. So, once the bell has been rung, you can't unring it. So how do you go home and tell your high school buddies and your parents that they were wrong? Your parents wanted you to go get an education, but not that education. So, these kinds of things, I see it. It happens all the time, and people will gravitate towards me and want to talk and figure out how do I handle this? How do I, make ends meet with this? So, conversation is very powerful, and so is exposure. We spend way too much time in our country talking about the other person, talking at the other person, and talking past the other person. Why don't we spend a little bit of time talking with the other person?
So, Daryl, I love that you've talked about travel, you've talked about exposure, and how both of those were really important to you. But I'm wondering if you would share with us, how did you get into work and how did you kind of start this process of engagement with people who could be easily perceived as your deepest enemies, right? Who don't even acknowledge that you are human or have the right to exist. So I just think it would be really important for our listeners to understand how you got to a place that you were willing and open to have these kinds of really powerful conversations with people who denigrate you.
Absolutely. And I think everything we do in life, from the day we step out of the womb to the day we take our first step forward, is a stepping stone towards what we're going to do in our future life. It prepares us. All right. So in order to understand how and why I do the work that I do outside of my chosen career, which is music. Music is my profession, but trying to improve race relations is my obsession. And my parents were U.S. Foreign Service. So I grew up as a State Department, American Embassy kid. And I began traveling around the world at the age of 3. So how it worked in 1961, I was born in 58. How it works is you get assigned to an American embassy in a foreign country for 2 years. And at the end of the assignment, you return home and you're here in the States for a few months, maybe a year if you request a year, and then you're back overseas again. for 2 years. Back and forth were the formative years of my life. I did kindergarten, first grade, third grade, fifth grade, seventh grade, all in different schools in different countries. And I did the in-between things back here. The thing that I experienced that most American kids, black or white, did not experience back during that time, and many of them still have not experienced that, is that my first introduction to school was abroad, kindergarten, right? Every one of my schools and classes that I had overseas had kids from all over the world. How is this? Because every country that had an embassy where our U.S. embassy was stationed, all of their kids went to the same school. So this little girl right here at this little desk next to me might have been from Czechoslovakia, this kid here from Nigeria, that kid from Japan, the kid in front of me from Russia. If you were to open the door to my classroom and stick your head in and look, you would say, oh my goodness, this looks like a United Nations of little children, because that's exactly what it was. So that being my first introduction to school, that became the baseline for what I thought school was supposed to be. However, every time I'd come back home, after my dad's assignment, I would either be in all black or black and white schools, meaning the still segregated or the newly integrated. And despite the fact that desegregation was passed by our U.S. Supreme Court 4 years before I was even born. I was born in 58 and it was passed in 1954. Schools did not integrate overnight. It took years and years. And even today, in 2026, in some parts of our country, they're still struggling with integration. So one of those times I came back, I was age 10, 1968. I was in the 4th grade, and we landed in Belmont, Massachusetts, about 8 miles outside of Boston. And so this was a newly integrated school. I use that word newly loosely because it's 1968, but it was passed in 1954. They just started integrating, right? So I'm in 4th grade, just 2 of us, me in 4th grade, and there was a little black girl in 2nd grade. So consequently, all of my friends were 4th and 5th graders, so they all were white. Several of my male friends were members of the Cub Scouts, and they invited me to join. I joined the Cub Scouts in 1968, and I was the only black scout anywhere in the area. So we had a parade along with the Girl Scouts, Brownies, Boy Scouts, 4-H Club, different organizations. And the streets are blocked off. Sidewalks were lined with nothing but white people. I'm the only black person in this parade that I could see. People are waving and cheering. We were marching from Lexington, Massachusetts to Concord to commemorate the ride of Paul Revere. I think they called it Patriot Day back then. And anyway, okay. So we're marching, and people are waving and cheering and yelling. The British are coming and smiling. Good time, right? Until we got to a certain point in this parade route when suddenly, pow, I'm getting hit with soda pop bottles and soda pop cans and just debris from the street by just a small group of spectators off to my right on the sidewalk. And I turned to see what was happening because I kept getting hit. And I saw a group of maybe 4 or 5 people mixed in with the larger crowd. And it was a couple of kids, perhaps a year or 2 older than me. I did not know them. And some adults, a couple adults who I assume were their parents, who were yelling and throwing things. I couldn't understand what they were saying because there's a marching band playing and all that kind of thing. And so my first thought was, when this happened, was these people over here, they don't like the Scouts. That's how naive I was, because I had no precedent for this behavior, right? It wasn't until my den mother, my cub master, my troop leader all came running. These are white people, right? And they covered me with their bodies and quickly escorted me out of this danger. And I kept trying to ask, what did I do? I didn't do anything. What did I do? Because I saw that none of my other fellow scouts were getting the special protection, just me. So I'm assuming that I had done something to incur their wrath or something. And all my leaders would do is kind of shush me and rush me along, tell me to keep moving. Everything will be okay. Just keep moving. I kept moving. They never answered my question. And by the end of course, the people didn't follow us, fortunately. But at the end of the parade, I went home. And my mother and father they were not at the parade, but I don't know where they were. I forgot now, but they were home when I got there. And they were cleaning me up and putting Band-Aids on me and asking me, how did you fall down and get all scraped up? I told them I didn't fall down. I told them what had happened. And for the first time in my life, my mom and dad sat me down and explained to me what racism was. Now, very important, believe it or not, at the age of 10, I had never heard the word racism. I had no clue what they were talking about because that word and that behavior did not exist in my sphere. I was around people from all over the world, right? We all got along. Even if we didn't look alike or speak the same language, we had slumber parties together, went to school together, played together, etc. So what are you all talking about? Race? What is that? You know, my 10-year-old brain could not process the idea that my parents were telling me that I was getting injured because of the color of my skin. It made no sense. I told them they were wrong. They assured me that they were right. To prove to them that they were wrong and I was right, I pointed out the fact that my fellow scouts looked just like the people on the sidewalk. My friends at school looked like the people on the sidewalk. My friends overseas, they were my little Danish or Swedish or French or German friends, looked just like the people on the sidewalk. Color had nothing to do with this. My parents said, yes, they did. So anyway, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th. And I remember that very well. Every major city in this country, nearby Boston, where I am right now, Washington, D.C., my hometown, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, Baltimore, New York, Los Angeles, all burned to the ground with violence and destruction, all in the name of this new word I had learned called racism. So now I realize that my parents had told me the truth, that this phenomenon does exist, and I accepted that. But what I did not understand and did not know was why. Why does racism exist? So at that age, I formed a question in my own mind, which was, how can you hate me when you don't even know me? And for the next 57, almost 58 years now, because I'll be 68 in a couple months, and I was 10 back then, I've been looking for the answer to that question. So who better to ask that question of than someone who would go so far as to join an organization that has over 100-year history of practicing hating people who don't look like them or who don't believe as they believe. Who ever heard of such an organization that practices hate? You know, just try to fathom that. It just boggles the mind. But anyway, so I began seeking out, these kinds of people to find out, how can you hate me? We don't even know me. All you see is this, and you've made an assessment about me that may or may not be true, right? Now, I will say this. To answer your question, that was my experience, and that's what prodded me to follow this. I'm somebody who, rather than get furious, I got curious. But let me say this, though. If I had not had all that travel and had all that exposure to different people, and my first encounter, let's say, with white people, for my first time, being around white people at an integrated school and so forth, my first experience was having rocks and bottles thrown at me. Would I be doing this work today? Maybe not. Maybe I'd be trying to stay as far away from those people as I could, But perhaps because I was exposed to people who looked like those people but did not behave that way, it made it hard for me to paint everybody with a broad brush.
Everybody, yeah. And allowed you to maintain some curiosity.
Exactly. Why do they behave this way and they don't behave this way, but yet they look the same, or they share all this in common?
Such an amazing story. It's so inspiring. What would you say? That there's this moment where you encountered difference. From the very beginning, you encountered difference, and it wasn't a problem, right? All these other friends at school and so forth, and then you encountered hostility, and for most, especially in the 21st century, most people are going to encounter some kind of serious diversity at some point. From now you've been studying and thinking about this for nearly 6 decades. What is the fork in the road? Why do some people lean into curiosity and that turns into some form of embrace of diversity, whereas other people go into suspicion and eventually hatred if it goes if it goes all the. What is that for? Maybe there's multiple forks in the roads, but what are the factors that you've seen that differentiate?
I can share that with you, absolutely. But right before that, so after the assassination of Dr. King, right, some of my friends, some of my close friends that I played with every day, after school or whatever, were no longer allowed to play with me by their parents, not by my parents. And I remember this. We lived in a duplex. And there, two-part house, downstairs and upstairs. We lived upstairs. So there are 2 front doors. The landlord lady lived downstairs. And now, in my mind at the time, keep in mind I'm 10 years old. To me, she was an old white lady. Now she may have been 30 years old, but because she was like my parents' age, so to me that was old. She was the nicest person in the world. She rented us her upstairs, and whenever she baked cookies, she always brought some over for us and all that kind of thing, right? Well, right after King was assassinated, when my friends would come over, if my mom was making me lunch or whatever, feeding me lunch, she would invite them in and make them lunch as well. Same thing if I went to their house and they're having lunch, their mom would invite me in and I have lunch over there. All of that stopped. Not my parents. Some of their parents, I'd go to someone's house, little Johnny can't come out today, or he's having lunch, but I wasn't invited in, or he's not coming out today. And then I'd go down to the park to meet up with some other friends, and about half an hour later, here comes little Johnny. I thought, you couldn't come out today. My mom doesn't want me playing with you anymore. What? Why? I don't know. And seriously, he didn't know. They just stopped that. What it is, to answer your question, Patrick, was fear. Ignorance is the root cause. Ignorance breeds fear. We were fearful. People are fearful of those things they don't understand. And the lady, the nice white old lady, she became, in my mind at that time, a mean old lady. Now, in retrospect, I understand why she did what she did. But I'm getting ahead here. So sometimes, when my friends would come over, we'd play on the porch. It was like a big porch and wide open porch. Well, she never bothered us. She even brought cookies out for all of us. So after the assassination, I remember we were playing on the porch one day, and she came out and she said, Daryl, I want you and your friends to play on your side of the porch. My side of the porch? I didn't know there was a side. There was no line going down it, my side of the porch. And then she said, better yet, I don't want you playing on the porch at all. You all need to play inside the house. Why is this lady being so mean? I didn't understand it. In retrospect, I totally understand it. She was fearful that some people, because, people were rioting in the streets all the time, right? During this time. She was fearful that some white people, who may not like the idea so much that this white woman is renting half her house to a black family, would see me playing on the porch and then, burn a cross in the yard or do something to harm her or harm her property or whatever. So she was doing it for, preservation of her property and perhaps preservation of me. That's how serious this thing was. And people didn't understand what was going on. That was probably the biggest riot of the 20th century, next to George Floyd or something. So anyway, that ignorance, breeds fear. You fear of what's going to happen to your property, what can happen to you. If you don't keep that fear in check, that fear in turn will escalate to hatred, because we hate the things that frighten us. If you don't keep the hatred in check, the hatred in turn will escalate into destruction. People want to destroy the things they hate. Why? Because those things frighten them. But guess what? At the end of the day, those things may have been harmless and we were simply ignorant. But that's how the chain unravels. Ignorance breeds fear, fear breeds hatred, hatred breeds destruction. And that's not just with adults, like our landlady or whoever, right? It's also prominent with children, because I give lectures at elementary schools, middle schools also, right? And sometimes I might be, of course, I tone it down a lot. But let's say I'm standing in the front of the class, right, of this little elementary school, and all these little desks and little kids sitting there from here 7 rows back. And I'm at the front of the class. And I'm just talking casually like I am now. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, I say, hey, there's a snake under your chair. And I point to somebody in the front row. The person in the front row throws their legs up in the air, throws their hands up in the air and starts screaming. And then everybody in the class 7 rows back throw their legs up in the air and start screaming. I'm pointing at the front chair, but people in the back row are throwing their legs up, right? And they start screaming and hollering. And then they realize, there's no snake here. I don't know what's wrong with this guy. He must be joking or something. And they all start laughing. And so I asked them, I said, why are you all throwing your legs up in the air and screaming and stuff? And then it comes out. They all said, I'm afraid of snakes. I hate snakes. There's your fear. There's your hatred. Right? They're afraid of snakes. They hate snakes.
And sometimes they might not even hate snakes, but the person next to them screamed.
Exactly.
Right? It's also sometimes we're just human beings. And I think that is true often
mob mentality. Exactly.
In race
mob
relations,
mentality.
Right? Like, I don't have any reason to be afraid, but someone who I trust is screaming. So maybe there's something to be afraid of, right?
And that's the definition of mass hysteria. So then I said, well, why do you hate snakes? Why are you afraid of them? Well, they're slimy. They're poisonous. Well, there's your ignorance. Not all snakes are poisonous. And if you've ever felt a snake, it's not slimy. It's dry. So ignorance breeds the fear. Fear breeds the hatred. So then I say to them, okay, well, obviously there's no snake under anybody's chair. I was just joking. But let's just say there really was a snake under your chair that I pointed out. What would you all want me to do with it? You know what they say? Kill it. There's your destruction right there. And these are little children, So what we need to do is it's kind of, I guess, counterintuitive, but we spend a lot of time in our country addressing the destruction. I say forget about the destruction. What's been destroyed is not coming back. That's why it's destroyed. It's gone away. You can't bring it back. Forget about the destruction. The destruction is nothing more than a byproduct, a symptom of the nucleus of the root cause. Forget about the hatred. That also is a byproduct. Forget about the fear, another symptom of the root cause. The root cause is ignorance. And if you can cure the ignorance, then there'll be nothing to fear. Because we only fear that of which we're ignorant, right? So if we can cure the ignorance, there's nothing to fear. With nothing to fear, there's nothing to hate. With nothing to hate, there's nothing to get mad about and destroy. The good thing is this: there is a cure for ignorance. That cure is called education and exposure. And that goes back to the Tower of Babel, right? So that's why it's so important to get to know your neighbor. Invite your neighbor. Treat your neighbor as you would treat your family. Love thy neighbor. Isn't that also in the Bible? So anybody who's outside the tower is your neighbor, and talks about, the different languages. They were scattered all over the planet, and had different languages. That's probably where the word Babel comes from. I don't know what he's babbling about. When somebody babbles, you don't know what they're saying. You're saying something. It's like a foreign language.
Obviously, this education and information is linked to being willing to converse with one another, right? Like I can't learn about you if I'm not willing to listen to you or talk to you. I can't really understand your perspective unless I'm willing to do that work. Have you seen, do you have some experiences in your work, particularly with white supremacists, where you have seen a pattern of what kind of language? How can we learn to talk to other people to show curiosity and maybe change the trajectory of conversations that are otherwise really combative and aren't leading to a good place? What are the patterns that our listeners can use to have more productive and educative conversations?
Okay, a few things. One, are you familiar with the term, one's perception is one's reality? Okay, whatever somebody perceives becomes their reality. Even if it's not real, it's still their reality. You, me, none of us can change somebody's reality. And, if we try, we're going to get pushback. We're going to get resistance because they think it's real. All right? Where we come from, 2 + 2 is 4. 2 + 2 may be 5 where they think it comes from. All right? And if you try to attack that, you're going to get resistance. Continue the attack, it's going to escalate. It's going to get loud, and then suddenly, boom, you're going to be rolling on the floor, hitting each other. No fight starts without yelling and screaming first, generally. So the first thing people want to do is when somebody is wrong, they want to accuse them of being wrong and point out they're wrong and tell them that they're wrong and they need to change this behavior or this belief or whatever it is, right? We should try to get away from that. Don't try to change somebody's reality. Even if you know 100% that what they're thinking is wrong. They believe it's right. That's their perception that created their reality. What you want to do is this. Rather than attack their reality and risk contention and possibly a physical confrontation or loss of friendship or something, you want to offer them a better perception or perceptions, plural. Because if they resonate with one of your perceptions, then they will change their own reality because one's perception becomes one's reality. So let me give you an example. I'll give you 2 examples. One hypothetical and the other one for real. Hypothetical. Let's say you have a young brother. Maybe he's 7, 8 years old. He goes to the magic show with his buddies and he comes home and tells you, Jennifer, you're not going to believe this. This magician on stage, he asked for a female volunteer and 50 women raised their hand. He looked around, he picked one out of the audience, brought her up on stage, shoved the microphone in her face, where are you from, what's your name? And then he had her climb into this long box and put her feet up the hole at this one end and put her head out the hole at the other end. And then he closed the box and he took a chainsaw and he went right through the middle of the box. And the chainsaw came out the bottom of the box. Jennifer, he cut this woman in half.
I saw it.
And then he told her to wiggle her feet. And she wiggled her feet out that hole. And you say, listen, it didn't happen like that. Yes, it did. I saw it. I was there. You weren't there. I saw it with my own eyes. You weren't even there. He's 100% correct. You were not there. Therefore, you could not have seen it. So how dare you tell me what I saw when you weren't even there? right? You've attacked his reality, and he's giving you pushback, right? And to prove to you that he is right and you're wrong, he carries on. Well, after this guy, cut this woman in half, she wiggled her feet. He took the half of the box with the feet and moved it over here to stage right, and the half with the head and moved it over there to stage left. And then he walked over there and talked to the lady's head, and the lady's head talked back to him. And then he brought the two halves back together. He did some abracadabra incantation over the box, and then he opened the lid, and she climbed out. He cut her in half. He separated her. He put her back together, and no blood, Jennifer. And you say, listen, it's an illusion. No, it's not. He's going to go off on you again. And you're destroying a relationship between you and your brother. All right. So rather than go down that road, what he's describing cannot happen, but he believes it happened. That's what magic's all about, deception, right? So rather than attack his reality, you say to him, listen, I hear what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. That's pretty cool. But let me ask you a question. Do you think that just maybe, perhaps, that it's possible that when the magician asked for a female volunteer and all these women raised their hand and he picked one out of the audience, do you think that just maybe she might work for him? She knows the trick, and she travels to every city all over the country with him, and she always sits in that same theater seat. So every time he asks for a volunteer, he looks around the audience and always zeroes in on her and brings her up on stage. And then when she climbs into this box, there is a pair of mannequin dummy legs laying on the floor of the box that are wearing the exact same stockings and stiletto heels that she has on. So she just, reaches over and shoves the poles of these legs out the hole. So only the ankles and the shoes are exposed. She takes her own knees and brings them up under her own chest. So her whole body is on that half of the box. So when the saw goes through, it never even touches her. He says, now wiggle your feet. She reaches over, grabs the end of those mannequin legs and shakes them, and the feet wiggle outside the hole. So now when he separates the two halves, she no longer has control over those feet. So he doesn't want you watching or looking at those feet because they can't move anymore. So he walks over to this side of the stage because you're going to follow him with your eyes, and he talks to the head. Of course her head's going to talk back because her whole body is over there. So now he brings the two halves back together, and he does all his abracadabra, and she reaches over, pulls those legs back into the box, leaves them laying on the floor, and she climbs out. And your brother says, that might be the only way that could work. You've offered him a better perception, and he has come to the conclusion. Your perception became his reality. All right? That's how you do things, and that's how I converse with these people, by offering perceptions.
I think that is a fantastic lesson, and I love the visual too, because I'm going to remember that. I assume people are going to remember that. But now I will tell you something.
I will tell you something, though. I went and saw David Copperfield, and I saw him make an elephant disappear off that stage for real, man.
You know it's happened. Nothing can convince you. Yeah.
None of y'all can convince me.
Nobody's going to convince you otherwise. I'm not going to try.
There. Yeah.
I also wouldn't be able to explain it to you. So I have no alternative reality to offer.
So that was hypothetical. So I'll tell you for real. So this Klan leader in Missouri, he had the largest Klan group in the country at the time. And he and I were becoming close. He was beginning to think about some of the things I was sharing with him, and I could see him moving in a better direction, right? If he had lived for another year, he would have been out of the Klan. But unfortunately, he was murdered. And I knew the murderer very well. I knew him very well. I knew his whole family. Very, very sad situation. So I went to his funeral, and I participated in his funeral out in Missouri. I played hymns on the church piano, for the service. And he had 3 sisters, and his mom and dad were there. Now, his family, his mother and father and his sisters had nothing to do with the Ku Klux Klan. They abhorred it, and they didn't understand how their son or their brother had gotten involved. He apparently had gone down the wrong hole or something, the wrong rabbit hole. And because he was not raised that way. So they didn't understand that. But they'd heard about him making friends with me. And they were happy to meet me and thanked me for taking the time to talk to him and all this kind of thing. And they could see, him slowly changing. So they kept in contact with me. And the father, he was the only son, 1 boy and 3 girls. These are all adult children, right? They're in their, 40s and 50s and stuff. And anyway, the father would call me once, twice a week. And he didn't want to talk to anybody in the clan. He wanted to talk to somebody who was real, who knew his son. And so he'd call me. And, we spent as much time with him as I could. One day he called. I'm sitting right here in my living room. And it was the father. And he was crying. He tells me he has a gun in his hand. And he's going to kill the person who murdered his son. It's like, whoa, I realized, this is a crisis. Something's got to be done here. Now, I knew that if I tried to give him a rational, logical argument, and tell him, what about reality, it's not going to work. If I said to him, look, man, if you go and do that, you're going to get locked up. You're going to be put, you're already an old man. You're going to be put in jail for 40 plus years. You're going to die in prison. He would have said, I don't care. This person killed my son. This person does not deserve to live. I get it. I understand that. All right. So no amount of rationale, or attacking his reality of, you're going to live out the rest of your life in prison, is going to dissuade him from doing what he felt he had to do to avenge his son's death. So I had to use, because he's coming from an emotional decision as opposed to a logical one. So I had to meet him where he was. If he was dealing logically, then I would give him a logical argument. But if he's dealing with emotion, I have to be emotional with him. So I said, look, you've already lost Frank. Frank was the son. I said, Frank's not coming back. I said, you got 3 beautiful daughters. I said, if you go out and kill this person, you know what's going to happen? You're going to lose all 3 daughters. Because they're not going to put you in prison in Missouri. They're going to put you in New York, maybe Rikers Island or San Quentin out in California. They're going to make it difficult for your family to come visit you. And you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison. You're not going to see your daughters. You're not going to be there to see your grandkids, so forth and so on. You're going to lose your whole family. Why do you want to throw away 3 beautiful daughters because you've lost Frank? That's what stopped him from doing it. I had to appeal to him emotionally. So, one's perception is very important. His reality was this person, does not deserve to walk the face of this earth any longer. I had to give him a better perception about, hey, you lost one. Why do you want to lose all 4?
Yeah. Wow, that's so powerful. Glad you were the one on the other side of that line, that phone line, that you'd created the relationship to be able to do that.
Now, you know what was crazy? I was over at a friend of mine's house. He was doing some video editing for me because I don't know how to do that stuff, but he was doing it for me. And my phone rang about 10, 15 minutes after midnight. And it was this other Klansman. And he asked me if I'd seen Frank, or if I'd talked to Frank, because Frank would call me every so often. And I said, no, I haven't talked to him in a few days. I guess this guy talked to him every day or something. And he goes, Daryl, I think something's wrong. I said, what do you mean? And he says, well, I talked to his wife, and something sounded kind of funny. And I said, oh, well, he and his wife were having issues. She was strung out on drugs, and he was trying to get her help into a rehab, and she was not going for it. And she was taking Klan money and buying drugs and pawning things out of the house. She was an addict. And pawning things out of the house to support her drug habit. And so Frank had told her, that he was considering divorcing her. And anyway, long story short, she killed him. She murdered him. And so anyway, the guy who called me said, when you talked to her, looking for her husband, she sounded kind of funny. He goes, I'm not sure, I think something's happened to Frank. And I said, they're having their little tiff, he'll probably come home tomorrow. You'll hear from him tomorrow, whatever. And he goes, I don't know. I'm going to call her back. So he called her back, and then he calls me at 4 o'clock in the morning and tells me that Frank was dead, that this woman had murdered him. And I said, did you call the police? He goes, no. I'm like, why are you calling me? But this is the level of trust that had developed. He's going to tell me who is the enemy, which is why he joined the Klan. He didn't like black people, right? He's going to confide something in me. He broke his Klan oath, by the way. Because when you join the Klan, you take an oath. One of the things is you never reveal Klan business to an alien. An alien is their term for a non-member. So now he's revealing Klan business to me. And, so, I don't need to hear any more about this. But he told me the whole story. And sure enough, long story short, she was arrested, and she sits in prison now for the rest of her life.
All of this to me is just a really good lesson that, doing the work of peace means doing hard things and being in hard places and having
Yes.
a willingness to have hard conversations.
And sometimes, we need to experience things that we never experienced, whether they're good or bad, so that we know the difference.
Yeah. So my last question for you, I mean, it's just so much more that we could talk about, but just for the sake of time, my last question for you is, in the midst of all of this, in the midst of all these conversations, the difficult things, these relationships that you've formed, how and where do you find peace in a world of conflict?
Okay, good question. I think, first of all, you must find peace within yourself. Exclude all the external things. Are you happy with what you're doing? Are you working to make your life better? All right. Find peace within yourself. Work hard at that. All right. And once you find peace within yourself, then you share that with other people so that they too can find peace. Okay. And when that is done, you have made peace with God. That's my feeling. God gave us a life in which he's given us, free reign of whatever we want to do. We want to do evil, we want to do good, we want to do whatever. Of course, I think he prefers that we do good and that we are peaceful kind of people. But you can't do that if you're focusing on trying to bring peace out there in the world and you're not peaceful yourself. It's like, whenever you fly on an airplane, the first thing these flight attendants tell you, in the event of an emergency, the thing is going to drop down from above you, the oxygen mask, right? And they always tell you, put yours on first before assisting others. Because if you can't breathe, how are you going to help somebody else, right? So find peace within yourself. Be satisfied that you are doing your work to please God and please yourself, and then share that peace with others, your neighbors, your friends, total strangers, right? That is God's work. That's what Jesus did. He mingled with the lepers, the prostitutes, the thieves, the whatever.
Amen. Well, thank you, Daryl. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for your life of work, of bridging differences and repairing the many breaches in humanity. It's really inspiring, and we're honored to have had you on Proclaim Peace.
It's my pleasure. And I have a new book. It's called The Clan Whisperer, and it has a lot more stories in there.
Well,
all right.
I'm hopeful that none of our listeners will be able to say, well, I can't possibly listen to my mother-in-law or to my next-door neighbor or the person next to me in the pews when you've set such a beautiful example for us of being able and willing to listen to people who really deeply disagree with us.
Jennifer, every Thanksgiving, I hear the same thing. I can't go have Thanksgiving dinner with my family because my sister voted for so-and-so and I voted for this one, and we just can't talk. Listen, look at me. You see this? If I can go to a Klan rally, you all can sit down with your family at Thanksgiving dinner.
Sit down with Grandpa. Yeah.
That's a good note to end on. So, Daryl,
perfect.
Daryl, thank you very much. Really,
thank you all very much
for joining us. Thanks for listening to this episode of Proclaim Peace. To hear more, you can subscribe on a podcast app of your choice or on YouTube. You can always find full show notes or transcriptions at proclaimpeace.org.
Proclaim Peace is a partnership between MWAG and Waymakers. You can learn more about Waymakers at waymakers.us. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.